Hello and welcome back to Joe Bailey Revision. Today we're going to be looking at The Making of America, Part 4, which is all about settlement and conflict on the plains. And it's from the year 1861 to 1877. So let's start. So first off, we've got the Transcontinental Railroad. And this was started in two places with two companies. And the government set out an act called the Pacific Railroad Act of 1862, and this promised money and land to companies for constructing the railroad. And this was particularly valuable land, as it was the stuff that ran along the side of the railroad, so a lot of people would want to buy it, meaning the companies would end up getting a really great deal from the government for doing this. So for this reason, two companies were set up to do this. The Union Pacific Company, which was set up by investment from land speculators, because they wanted to sell the land, and the Central Pacific Company, which was set up by investment from 5 shopkeepers. The Union Pacific Company began in Nebraska, which was in the east, and the Central Pacific Company began in California, which was in the west, and these two would eventually join together in Utah, which was the midpoint of the two, and at a place called Promontory Point on May 1869. This was finished, and it was completely finished, the construction was, and people could start using the railroad. So yeah, next let's look at the impact of the railroads. So they crossed Indian land, which divided buffalo hunting grounds, and also the fact that they crossed Indian lands, it caused cattle towns and homesteads to be set up along there around the Indian land, which annoyed the Indians, because they were of course taking a place where they lived and setting up there. So the government, they paid over $50 million to the companies. They also had to give away a large amount of land to them to get this deal done. However, there are some good things to the government, because many more farms were made in the West, which would strengthen the economy and increase the popularity of the government as they're allowing people to set up new lives and helping them. And also it had an impact on the migrants, because they could have a safer journey. Before, they would have to go on things like the Oregon Trail and take great risks when travelling. Now they just had to get on a train. Also, there was a lot of cheap land from railway companies. So because the railroads were set up, the land was able to be sold cheap to them, and they could buy it and go there. So next, let's look at our second part, the cattle industry. So the ex-Confederate states had no money in Texas, because they of course lost the war, but they had a lot of cows, and these cows were called Texas Longhorns. And people in the north, they lacked meat, but they had a lot of money, so they would pay a premium for cows. And we can see here that a cow, Texas Longhorn, would be worth $1 or $2 in Texas, but it's worth $30 in Kansas. So this was an incredibly profitable thing. And yeah, as some people found out, and we'll see in a minute, Texan ranchers returned from the Civil War to find larger herds, which made it more of an opportunity for them as they had so many to sell. The ranchers paid cowboys to organize cattle drives north. An example of when this happened, the first time it happened was in 1866. Charles Goodnight hired 18 cowboys to drive 2,000 cattle to the markets, and they sold this amount of cattle for $24,000, and that was even more money at the time than it seems like it would be now, which is a lot of money. And news of this success spread, encouraging others to do the same and drive massive amounts of cattle to the north and to the east. Mainly the east, yeah. And some made money selling cattle to US forts and reservations. That was another way they could sell their cows. And this became easier due to the creation of the railway. Because if you think about it, before they would have to go all the way to their location. Now they could use the railway in that. And the way this was done was the creation of cow towns. Cowboys now only had to take cattle to cow towns, and at cow towns, cattle would be loaded onto trains towards the north, so they wouldn't have to go with them all the way there. The first cow town, it was called Abilene, and it was in Kansas, set up in 1867 by someone called Joseph McCoy, and it made a large amount of money for him because there was so much business there and so many people passing through. However, cow towns were also bad because they were wild and violent, as there was a lot of gambling, prostitution and drinking at them. So next, let's look at our next group of people, the homesteaders. So a lot of government actions allowed people to set up homesteads. So there was the Homestead Act in 1862, which meant that each family was allowed 160 acres of land in the West if they lived on it and farmed it for 5 years. So if you think about it, you're basically, you're getting free land. All you have to do is live there for a few years. It's a great deal from the government. They made it even better, as in 1873, they made the Timber Culture Act, which meant that settlers could get an extra 160 acres of free land if they planted 40 acres of trees. So you just had to plant trees, and then, it gave you extra land. And we'll see why in the future that was important. There was then the Desert Land Act of 1877, which said that settlers could buy 640 acres cheaply in an area of low rainfall, because not many people wanted that land because they couldn't get much rain, so they were selling it for cheaper, which may have helped a lot more people gain a massive amount of land. So let's look at people's reasons to move west. So let's start with push factors. So there was the end of the Civil War in America in 1865. So former soldiers would move there because they wanted a new start, because everything back home had been destroyed and lost, and they would have many memories of fighting in that war. It would be bad for them. Also, ex-slaves were now free, and many moved to avoid discrimination, as there were still a lot of laws against them in the South and even a few in the North, and if they were going to a completely new land, there wouldn't be any. And this was like the black codes in the South that were set up that we looked at last episode. Also, push factors, there was a lot of European immigration there, because Jews and other religious groups were persecuted in certain places in Europe. There was a lot of unemployment and poverty in some European countries, such as Britain, Ireland, Russia and Germany. And Scandinavian farmers lacked land in their home countries, so decided, if there's loads of land in America, we're going to go there. There were also pull factors as well, making people want to move west. There were advertisements in the eastern states talking about how good it was and how everyone should go there. The 3 government acts, of course, would have pulled people because they were getting a good deal there. There was letters from people already in the West, so people who had done that journey were encouraged to write about it and tell people how good they thought it was. Encouragements from newspapers as well, the media. That's where the idea of manifest destiny first came up. It was written in a newspaper article, and that's where it originally spread from. So next, we've got the many problems that these people faced being homesteaders, but also the solutions they found around the problems. So water shortages. So droughts were common and water was needed a lot, but they didn't have a lot in this new land. They needed water to drink and for crops. So to solve this, wind pumps were used to get water from underground. So that's one way they managed to get the water. They had a lack of fuel because there was no wood to burn because there was no trees. And the fact that they couldn't have any fuel would mean winters were freezing. So to solve this, they used dried buffalo and cow droppings and they burned them on the fire. So next we've got building materials. So there was no wood for houses and fences. So you got to think, how would they make houses? Well, instead, sod houses were built out of mud bricks, and that's how they did it. Although these houses were not permanent and would often get damaged by the rain, so would have to be frequently repaired, which is one of the important things about the Timber Culture Act. It ensured that there would be wood eventually in the future after all of the trees had grown. So next, barbed wire was invented for fences in 1874. So that's another solution to there being no wood for fences. Create something completely new that we can get loads of to fix our fencing problem. So next we've got ploughing. So the land there was hard and too tough to plough. So they invented a new plougher called the sod buster, which could break hard mud. It would help a lot. Another problem people faced there was isolation, and this was a very big problem. People on the plains often lived far apart with their individual homesteads. So to solve this, churches and schools were built to bring people together and encourage community involvement so people wouldn't feel like they were on their own. And next, there was a lot of dirt and disease. This is because there was a lack of water, so people couldn't stay clean, and also there were a lot of pests and stuff like mice, fleas, and bedbugs. This would eventually, of course, improve over time as they would get better resources and stuff, as more people moved over and more things were made. So next, let's look at our final part of today. Okay, so we're going to look at the Indian Wars. And over time, Indian land was gradually taken by the USA as they travelled through the country, and people set up their homesteads, and it gradually took over their land. And there were three underlying reasons for conflict between Indians and whites. There was guns and fear, that more people on both sides owned guns. So this meant that it was easier to start conflicts with each other because they both had strong enough weapons to fight. Settlers owned more advanced weaponry, so would start many battles and end up winning, and that's why the Indians often didn't stand much of a chance. Also, hardening attitudes. Many whites believed they were genetically superior to the Indians, so should rightfully take their land. And many Indians joined warrior societies to fight back. So this was really the time where the two sides decided, we can't work together, we have to go against each other. And next says ecological reasons. So settlers took resources and land from the Indians, so the tribes had to fight back as they struggled to survive with less, because they've adapted to live from the land from all this time, and the fact that the land's being taken, they can't do that anymore. They can't survive in a society like this, unfortunately. So next, we've got the Plains Wars. So this starts with Little Crow's War in 1862. So the government agent in charge refused to allow Dakota Sioux to eat emergency food stores on the reservation. And instead of giving it to them, he said, let them eat grass, as an insult. And in response, the Dakota Santee Sioux began a rebellion, killing 500 settlers. And yeah, they did that. And after this, the US Army was sent in to protect the settlers, which makes sense because a lot of them were killed. And after the US Army was sent in, 38 Sioux warriors were hanged and hundreds were imprisoned because of what they did. And the Sioux were forced to travel to a new reservation. And this new reservation wasn't any bigger, so it didn't fix their problems with not having enough food. In fact, it had worse and less land, so there wasn't as much food there at all, and it was even smaller, so they struggled to survive before because they needed the emergency rations. What are they going to do now? They're barely going to be able to survive even more. It's going to be worse for them, even though that's the reason why it all started. So next, let's look at the Sand Creek Massacre in 1864. So the Cheyenne warriors hunted outside of the reservation because they didn't have enough food, as the reservation wasn't big enough for them to sustain all the people. And one settler ended up getting killed while they were out there. So the 3rd Colorado Volunteers Unit went to protect the settlers. They were led by someone called John Chivington, who wanted to kill the Indians, and the 3rd Colorado Volunteers were known as the Bloodless Third before this, because they hadn't proved themselves yet. They'd never been in a fight. And basically, they were very much against the Indians, and they just wanted any excuse to go and fight them. So that one settler's death caused them to go over there and massacre 100 of the Cheyenne, including women and children. The Cheyenne didn't really fight back. They had no chance. They were just getting completely murdered, and that's why it's called a massacre. The Indians were forced back to the reservation, and no extra land was given to them. So they weren't given any extra land to provide them with that extra food. Also, only 6 of the US Army were arrested, and the newspapers wrote mostly positive stories of their victory, saying how good they were for attacking the Indians, when actually they just went there and slaughtered them all. So it shows you that the media back then was very biased towards the views of the settlers. So next is Red Cloud's War, which is from 1865 to 1868. This is slightly different because the Indians end up actually winning. So gold was found in the Black Hills, which was sacred Indian land, and people tried to go there and mine. The settlers tried to go there and mine. So the Bozeman Trail was a trail that went through Sioux land to get to this mining place. And Indians started to attack miners along the trail because they didn't want people going to their sacred land, and they didn't want people going on their land at all, really. So the US Army built forts along the Bozeman Trail to protect the miners because they thought that the land was theirs anyway, and they wanted to make sure people didn't get hurt. And then the Lakota Sioux attacked one of the forts and managed to seize Fort Kearny. And at Fort Kearny, Captain Fetterman and his troop of 80 men were killed by the Indians. And that means the Indians won, and due to this, a new treaty was signed, making the Black Hills Lakota Sioux land, and no one could change that. And the US lost their access to all of the gold there in this battle, and the forts along the trail were taken down, so they no longer had any presence there. So the Lakota Sioux got a lot of good things out of it, because of the Fort Laramie Treaty of 1868, which let them have that land as their own. So next, we've got one final war. It's the Great Sioux War. This really is the end game, the war to end the wars. So, US General Custer found gold in the Black Hills. And of course, we remember the Black Hills were Lakota Sioux land. No one was meant to be there, but Custer went there anyway. He's a bit of a mad lad. And by 1875, tens of thousands of miners arrived following Custer and going there to try and get the gold. And Cheyenne and Sioux attacked an army camp by the Rosebud River on the 6th of June in response to this, as Sitting Bull, who was a Sioux leader, saw a vision of victory, and they did in fact win. The army were wiped out in that area, but there was still a lot of miners going there to take gold. So yeah, then there was, in a response back from the US from the attack there was the Battle of Little Bighorn, where General Custer was sent to find the Indians and drive them towards the main army. So General Custer split his forces and charged with 210 cavalrymen against 1,800 Indian warriors. And Custer and his men were defeated there because, for many reasons, the Indians had more fighters, so they had 1,800 instead of 210. They were led by a great military leader who was Crazy Horse, who was one of their chiefs. He was really good. The Indians had better weaponry. So at this time, surprisingly, they had a lot of repeating rifles, when the actual US Army just had standard guns, which repeating rifles were better. Also, they had bows, which would never jam or overheat, so they weren't unreliable. So some of the US Army's weapons might broke, but the bows, they never break. They don't run out of bullets, really. You can carry a lot more ammo, I guess, as well. And Custer's defeat with his men is always seen as a heroic defeat, or at least it was, by all the media around there. They would try and say it was he died a hero, even though he lost due to his bad planning, and he wasn't really that much of a good guy anyway. But yeah, he was kind of a sign of America at that time, and how they wanted to get rid of the Indians. How he was one man rising against them with his warriors. Yeah, that. Despite winning the battle, the Sioux lost the Great Sioux War. And this is because they were pursued and attacked throughout the autumn and winter, and they weren't prepared for winter warfare. And after the war, the Sioux were forced onto reservations and had to live lives like that, where they lived on land and it was split up, and this sort of land was assigned to this tribe, and they had really small spaces and had to live in usual houses and couldn't live nomadic anymore. The fact that they were attacked in winter as well. The idea of the Indians, they always fought each other, the different tribes, but they would never fight in winter. They'd only fight in summer or in times when, that sort of time. They would never fight in winter. So they had no training with that, or no chance really. So that was Joe Bailey Revision, Settlement and Conflict on the Plains. Thank you for watching, and goodbye.